Thank you, Xander. The real pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone who has taken time out of their day to join in. So my name's Libby Pansing, as Xander mentioned. I'm going to kind of take over the first initial part of this presentation and then hand it over to my colleague Brian to finish it up. So today I'm going to be talking about our South Central Oregon integrated post-fire resilience strategy. So let's get my screen share up here. All right. Everybody see that okay?
Yeah, that looks great.
Perfect. All right. So American Forests has had the honor of working on this project for just over a year now in partnership with some really great collaborators. The Fremont-Winema National Forest, Oregon Department of Forestry, Klamath Tribes, Green Diamond and Collins Timber Companies, and the Nature Conservancy Sidecan Marsh. So this is a labor of love from a post-fire environment, and we're gonna talk about that strategy and some of the social aspects that have come as a result of that. So at risk of, let's see if I can actually get this to work here. There we go, okay. At risk of essentially explaining a bunch of information that you all are already aware of, I do want to take just a second to kind of root this strategy in the context of what's happening across the wider West. So I think as most folks know, fire regimes are changing, right? We have increases in burned area, and this is what's shown on the left-hand figure here. Each of these lines shows the green line shows that trend in increasing area burned over time since 1985, and that's happening virtually across the entire Western United States. Concurrently, we've also seen an increase in the severity of fires across the West, so almost an 8-fold increase in the amount of area burned at high severity. And so these changes in our fire regimes and to what's happening on these post-fire landscapes are really necessitating new ways for us to look at planning, post-fire planning, and the strategies that we develop in order to do this work. So if we talk about increasing area burned, we're more cognizant of the fact that these landscape scale restoration approaches really matter. Conducting these small reforestation projects without an eye to the larger implications for landscape scale ecosystem structure and function really risks unwise investments, limited success, and consequences for surrounding communities. So we really do want to start focusing on these all lands approaches that are collaborative in order to achieve successful landscape scale restoration. It also makes GIS analysis for post-fire planning more important. So when we start talking about consequences for these really large fire years from a needs assessment perspective, prioritization perspective, and implementation standpoint, the problem really quickly becomes intractable. We can't go out and ground truth 1 million acres, 650,000 acres to look at where we actually need to do this. So we really do need to focus on these post-fire GIS analyses in order to get us rooted in how we want to proceed. And then when we start talking about fire severity, one of the things that we've tended to focus on are these high severity burn patches. And while those are really important from a reforestation standpoint, because we don't want to risk type conversions to non-forested vegetation types or prolonged or protracted recovery times, we do want to start focusing on some of these other areas that have burned at low or moderate severity throughout the landscape, because that implies and connects back into this landscape scale restoration approach. There are spaces where the fire could have beneficial effects. There are spaces where fuel management is going to be important because we are trying to prevent reburns in areas that have been planted, or just reburns more generally. So we want to start talking about this from a more comprehensive perspective so that we can move forward. And then lastly, we really want to understand the cost and infrastructure needs that are really dwarfing any previous requirements for post-fire environments so that we can effectively scale up to meet these challenges. So cost of inaction, I feel like most folks are probably familiar with this too, but if we don't start to take these actions and move forward with post-fire reforestation and restoration, we do risk losing forest cover. we increase the risk of future high severity reburns, consequences for our hydrology and stream runoff, carbon storage, wildlife, and rural economies. So it's really these all encompassing things that we're trying to avoid when we start talking about these large landscape scale strategies. So bring in the Klamath and Lake Counties areas in South Central Oregon. There has been an explosion of fire activity there over the last 5 years. Since 2018, about 650,000 acres have burned in these counties, and that's about the size of Rhode Island. So this is really where we're zooming into for this strategy, is these 6 fires that you can see on your screen that were impacted by wildfire since 2018. And I'm assuming most of us have heard of the 2021 bootleg fire, which burned about 475,000 acres just in that one go. Okay, we're gonna advance. All right. So what I really wanna highlight as kind of a continuation of this idea that we do need these all land multi-jurisdictional and collaborative approaches to post-fire restoration work is that this strategy really is built on that strong foundation of partnership. The Klamath and Lake Counties have a really long history of collaborative work that they have engaged in, and that sets the foundation for everything that you'll see throughout the rest of this presentation. They have a legacy of shared stewardship that has grown their reforestation and restoration funding and treatment acres over the years. And this is already paying dividends. And Brian will talk about some of this later, but I do just want to highlight that this has looked like some additional crews to help with reforestation on National Forest System lands, funding for seedlings and other restoration activities. And then also ODF just received, Oregon Department of Forestry just received $5 million from Forest Service, state and private, to build a reforestation program to support non-industrial private landowners. So we're already seeing the ramifications of some of these partnerships blossom across this landscape. Okay, so the strategy. So what this looks like is American Forest and the Fremont-Winema National Forest convened a process with the Oregon Department of Forestry, Klamath Tribes, Green Diamond, Collins, and the Nature Conservancy Cycan Marsh to try to develop this post-fire restoration strategy. So we developed a core team of individuals that met pretty regularly from late 2001 to early 2002 to try to develop this strategy. So there were copious amounts of conversations about reforestation, fuel management needs, fuel breaks, those types of considerations that really address the holistic landscape needs. And we took that information and created this strategy with input from these partners. The really neat piece that emerged is essentially there was a similar vision across all of these landowners, which is to establish fire and climate resilient forests within the fire footprints such that prescribed fire can be used for long-term management. So that was really consistent across our industrial timber company partners, private industrial groups, and the Forest Service. So really neat to kind of see that vision, that cohesive vision shine through. So the goals of this strategy were to outline the scope of the restoration need at a landscape scale within these focal fires, provide cost estimates and for those identified restoration needs, and then highlight project planning considerations that include climate change, adaptive management, and uncertainties. And one thing I really do want to highlight about this strategy is that it was not intended to provide site-specific prescriptions. Those site-specific considerations require ground truthing and must adhere to those relevant regulations. And so we're really just trying to provide that footprint from which we can move forward to help understand where the need is across the landscape and provide some general guiding principles, not necessarily wanting to tell people what to do where. Okay, so this started off with this needs assessment. So as I mentioned with the GIS analysis, we sat down and really just wanted to break this landscape into different categories of reforestation need. And so if you look on the left-hand side, hopefully you all can see my mouse, but there is a circular kind of graph table that shows the number of acres by landowner type and land category type. And these categories down here took into consideration a few different aspects of what might be needed on this landscape. So we have pre-fire forested areas that are candidates for planting and fuel reduction. So we want to go plant those areas, and we think that there's probably going to need to be some fuel management activities that are going to occur. Number two is forested areas or previously forested areas that were candidates for planting with no fuel reduction. This medium red color is just areas that are candidates for natural regeneration and fuel reduction. Category 4 was looking at areas that are candidates for natural regeneration without fuel reduction. And then we have a couple of management categories. So this lighter green color are areas across the landscape that didn't necessarily burn at high severity enough to warrant reforestation activities, but do likely require fuel management across the landscape. And so that to mitigate high severity, future high severity fire, promote safety for workers and recreationalists, those types of things. Other vegetation types that may require maintenance treatments. And then these last two categories are related to the meadow systems that are distributed across the landscape. And some of those may require removal of fuels, so removal of standing conifers in order to promote healthy hydrology, while others might just need other restoration activities. And so in total, this is about 577,000 acres of areas that are have candidate needs distributed across the landscape. And if you look over here at this pie chart, I never thought I would ever include a pie chart in a presentation ever, but here we go. There's a first for everything. About 42% of this landscape is probably going to need some type of reforestation activity, and about 35% just needs fuels treatment. So there's a large swath of this land that actually is going to require probably some kind of management intervention. Okay, so what we did once we had these locations across the landscape identified for these different restoration categories is we wanted to start talking about how we were going to prioritize these different areas across the landscape. And what that looks like is we actually prioritize the areas that were in need of reforestation. And this is essentially because reforestation becomes harder as time since fire passes. So we want to be able to get into those areas that are high priority and to increase chances of success as soon as possible. And so this prioritization process looks like conversations with our partners to try to determine which categories or what variables we should consider in this prioritization process. And so you can see this on the table on the left-hand side. So we looked at areas that were like legally mandated. We talked about productivity, focusing on areas that might be more highly productive and therefore more successful in the long term. Areas that might not necessarily have fuel loading. So again, we can get in there really quickly and do our work sooner rather than later. Slope aspects, again, an idea to look at what might be successful. And then variables like percent change in end of century climatic water deficit. So that can help us understand where we might be most successful in the long term considering climate change. So this map that you can see kind of shows the entire priority areas across the landscape that we're recommending that partners focus on first. Lastly, we took a stab at trying to locate where fuel breaks might be wise across the landscape. And so to contextualize these a little bit, we really want to highlight that these fuel breaks and any potential work that is done on them, once they are established, they're really intended to support decreasing fire behavior in moderate fire weather. In extreme fire weather, we're intending that they are areas for egress and ingress for fire suppression crews, but in those cases, they might not necessarily prevent movement of a fire across the break. So these were built off of collaborative efforts that had been done previously in the region using a pod framework, so potential operational delineation. And we basically did a similar prioritization process that was based on social and ecological considerations. So that looks something like this. So the lightest green are the highest priority fuel breaks across the landscape. And this turned out to be about 500 plus miles of fuel breaks across this landscape. So it's not insubstantial, but the prioritization process essentially took into consideration where green trees were remaining on the landscape. So to try to protect those locations, distance to the nearest population centers. And then we also tried to break up large swaths of private lands that didn't have fuel breaks identified during that previous process to try to make sure that we're protecting not just National Forest System lands, but private lands as well. So costs, I'm just going to show very briefly. I think this is probably one of the least interesting pieces to show, but more important for the planning process. So we divided this across the Forest Service lands, private industrial, private non-industrial. And I just want to highlight that the total cost across all land management jurisdictions, so this includes also jurisdictions that are not included in those three breakdowns, is over $644 million. So not insubstantial here. And yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later, I think. But so we also tried to help guide implementation where possible. So I want to focus a little bit on National Forest System lands and then private industrial lands. So on National Forest System lands, what you're looking at in this map is implementation units that were created in partnership with the Fremont-Winema National Forest. And these implementation units are bordered by roads and about 3,000 to 5,000 acres in size. And that size was chosen because it's the same size as the broadcast burning units used across the forest. So the idea is that we want to go in and treat all of the acres within an individual implementation unit to successfully reintroduce prescribed fire within these units. So the prioritization here also follows reforestation need. So the higher the prioritization of the implementation unit, the more areas within that implementation unit that are at high priority for reforestation. And then on private lands, recognizing that there's a whole host of different requirements and decisions that are going into how implementation happens on these private lands. What we wanted to do was highlight a couple of different scenarios as to how they might approach it and what those costs might be for going through that process on private lands. So on this left-hand side table here, you can see broken down by private industrial and private non-industrial, basically the number of acres and cost to treat high reforestation priority areas, moderate and low. And so that's essentially intended to be a choose your own adventure in terms of how much money you would want to contribute to a particular location. If you want to do all of the high priority areas, great. You need $29 million in order to do the fuel reduction and reforestation on those lands. If you want to do, and then on the right-hand side, if you want to do 25% of all the other assessed need for treatment types outside of reforestation, you're going to need another $14.6 million to get that done. So it's essentially intended to help facilitate decision-making processes without necessarily determining for them what they might want to do. All right, I'm just going to touch on this briefly because Brian's going to talk about it in a minute, I believe, but we have two implementation scenarios for the National Forest System, and I'm only going to highlight it for the National Forest System because I think we understand a little bit better what the constraints in capacity are, but also it's representative of really, I think, something that is happening across jurisdictions. So the National Forest System land is hoping to get to about 15,000 acres of reforestation per year by 2026. If they do that, they're going to need 67 new positions across the forest in order to support those activities. So really, they're going to need a whole heck of a lot of support just to get there. I'll pause there. So part of what we did for the strategy was essentially to just take a look at these staffing needs, where they were, where the gaps were, and what the needs might be in order to achieve these restoration activities across the forest. The last piece that we included in the strategy is just management considerations more broadly. So these are intended to provide a framework to folks who are going in to do this restoration actions on the ground and help frame how they might want to think about these activities moving forward. So one of the key tenets that we focused on throughout this strategy is climate smart restoration and reforestation. So this strategy over the last few years, and it really is, really provide us an opportunity, a silver lining, to restore these forests in a way that they are adapted to future climates. And so we're really encouraging folks to think about implementing climate smart restoration activities at 3 different scales. At the landscape scale, so that might include, reforesting where success is most likely, or mitigating fuels in order to reduce the likelihood of a high severity reburn. Those types of activities to the site and project level. So that could be planting at lower densities. It could be using strategic spacing to recreate the landscape scale heterogeneity that existed pre-fire, or using seed that's adapted to future climates. And then lastly, another one of the tenets is adaptive management. So we really wanted to encourage folks that when they go do these activities, they should be monitoring so that we can respond in real time to what the consequences and outcomes of these restoration activities are. So I won't delve too deeply into these, but fuels, I think hopefully I've made it clear that this is a big part of this strategy, is really trying to understand where those fuels are in the landscape, decrease the probability of high severity reburns in the future, and protect reforestation investment. So that's going to be a key piece moving forward, and making sure that these landscapes are resilient to future climate change and to any additional disturbances that might pass through the landscape. Again, Brian's going to touch on this briefly, but seed supply is a big issue. We looked at the seed supply across the landscape, and the resounding finding is that current seed inventory and the pace of collection cannot support current or future needs. We're just not on pace to actually collect the seed that are needed in order to do the activities that are required on the ground. So we really do need to focus on seed collection, orchard creation and maintenance in order to scale appropriately to where we need to be. We're also considering expanding seed sources beyond the current breeding zones. And that's for 2 reasons. It's because we need to do a better job of getting seed in our bank that we can use to reforest, and also to anticipate future climates and kind of follow that assisted migration paradigm. And then lastly, the Fremont-Winema National Forest is on track to develop new seed transfer guidelines that can help better understand how seeds can and might be moved across the landscape to better prepare for climate change. All right. The big elephant in the room, and I think one of the major concerns, for most folks across these dry Western forests, really is vegetation management. So how do we manage competing vegetation to ensure that conifer growth is not slowed and that we can reintroduce prescribed fire in a timely manner? So we highlight lots of trade-offs and potential alternative actions in the strategy, but our main take home really is that some of these conversations need to be had, and we need additional data to understand what the consequences of these are and what choices are appropriate in different types of conditions. And then lastly, before I hand it over to Brian, I again just want to highlight this importance of the adaptive monitoring component. So monitoring is going to be key to making sure that we are successful in the long term. We are in a period of no real, or at data scales at least, no real historical comparison. And so understanding how to move forward really is going to require additional data to understand how we're being successful, where we're failing and where we might need to pivot and how we can respond in real time in order to ensure that there is success across this landscape long term. So I'll be happy to share the strategy with folks once it's released. I'm going to turn it over to Brian to let him talk a little bit about where the strategy has already led us.
Thanks, Libby. Again, thank you for having us today. It's great to talk to you and share what we've been working on. For a little bit of reference, I came into this process kind of as the science piece of this was wrapping up. And so what I'm going to share with you today is kind of my perspective, a little bit on where we're going, kind of next steps we're already working on, and then some lessons learned and thoughts I've had just from conversations I've had with various folks who are involved, and just thoughts I've had, again, coming in kind of at the end of this project and seeing where it is and where it's going, and what some potential next steps are. So with next steps, I included a picture of a dug fir field. You can kind of see the trees are just germinating there. It's not just a bare field. There is a little bit of green in the picture. And that was a little sowing error. Oh, next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about staffing. So, Libby mentioned that the Forest Service system in Fremont-Winema, that this increased reforestation need from these fires, we identified close to 67 additional staff that would need to be brought on to meet that goal. So one of the things we're doing right now is working with the Fremont-Winema through an agreement process to actually provide American forest field crews. So there are staff who are working essentially on contract for the forest to try to help meet some of those work needs. Now, we're looking to have a crew of 6 people next summer. That's nowhere close to the 60 plus that are mentioned in the strategy. But it's a start. It gets us moving in the right direction. Just for reference, since I have a bunch of people online, we will be posting those crew positions very quickly for recruitments. So if you can think of anyone, of anyone who might be looking for some reforestation work for roughly a 7-month field season, we're going to be hiring pretty quickly. Again, they should be posted the next week or 2. So going forward, we're looking at trying to figure out how we can help the Forest Service ramp up 60 plus new positions. And for reference, for those of you who aren't familiar with the area, one of the offices is in Paisley, Oregon, which is a town of about 350 people. And if we're talking bringing a dozen or more people into a town of 350, there's a lot of changes to kind of the population dynamics in that town. Just housing availability, for example, gets to be a challenge when, if you make some just rough assessments, you're probably looking at about 100 homes in the town of Paisley. And if we're looking to add 12 individuals, that's, in theory, 12 new homes. That's a 12% change. And if you think about, 12 homes doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about that in terms of a large city of, Phoenix or Seattle or Portland or something, and adding 12%, that's kind of scary to think of. And so it's going to be a challenge to figure out how we can help bring those people in. So some things we're working on is workforce development. My experience coming from a nursery manager, one of the things I ran into was I could hire unskilled labor all day long. Unskilled labor applicants were not hard to find. Mid-career professionals also were not terribly hard to find. What was really, really difficult to find were early career professionals. Fresh out of college people that want to work in reforestation. And so some of the things we're working on is trying to figure out how we can reach out to people to let them know that these jobs exist and get them interested in it. I went through 3 forestry programs across the United States. And it wasn't really until I finished those programs and went to work that I really learned what opportunities existed in reforestation. I even worked on a site preparation crew when I was 19, and I still didn't understand that these jobs and nurseries and seed collection and reforestation really existed at that professional level. And so I think as an industry, we need to work to let folks know that these jobs exist and they are good jobs. I mean, again, I've been doing this for about 20 years, and everyone I've worked with is super passionate about what they do and really, really enjoy what they do. So we need to spread the word to get people more interested in doing this work. And I don't think it's because of the type of work. I think it's a lack of knowledge that these jobs exist. We've also been working on trying to develop intern and apprentice programs. Again, we're going to be hiring a field crew, a seasonal field crew. So it's going to be a way to bring people in, young professionals, to bring them in, get them some seasonal experience. And, trying to figure out how do we bring these people into these rural communities. One of the things we're working on is as we bring on these field crews, these seasonal staff, to get them placed in these communities, working with the local forest, with the Forest Service folks, or potentially with some of the other partners, whether those be state, private, or other federal land managers, and get them vested in those communities while they're young and working seasonally, and get them to where they want to be there. Our crew that was there last summer, at least 2 of those individuals have expressed interest in staying in the community that they moved to and potentially beginning to work for the Forest Service as their career develops. And so I think the more we can build that and utilize some of some of the benefits that we have as a nonprofit that we can utilize to bring people in and get them into these communities, I think it will be helpful. So again, partner staffing increases, things like what we're doing, but also working across, the various landowners. There's, in the case of the Fremont-Winema, the Bootleg Fire area, there are a couple private landowners in the area, and there's potential for them to utilize, their organizations to increase staffing to assist with these efforts as well. Another one is rethinking how we work. I put ICS, Incident Command System, in there as just a thought that I've had, not saying we need to mimic the fire response. But one of the thoughts that's crossed my mind many times, I've heard reference to a number of roughly 4,000 people needed to meet the need, the planting crew needs in the Western United States due to recent fires. And if you think about wildfire response, mobilizing 4,000 people is not a big deal. We do that all summer long for fires over and over and over again. And again, I'm not suggesting that we develop 20-person crews, that we mobilize like fire crews where they're 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there, back home for a day, 2 weeks out. But realizing that we have systems in place that are really, really good at mobilizing people to these communities to do the suppression work, and thinking about how we might be able to adapt some of those processes for post-fire work, and really, maybe thinking about what happens after the fire's out in a similar mindset as we think of after the fire starts. That it's still an emergency that we need to respond to, and we need to figure out how we can utilize these resources we already have to help respond. Next slide, please. So thinking about seeds. So Libby mentioned the seed quantity, seed availability, and it's a challenge. It's not unique to this area or this organization. Again, I worked in the nursery business for quite a while, and seed availability, depending on species and location, is a challenge kind of around at least the Northwest, and I think the larger Western United States as a whole. It's not just total quantity, but it's quantity where you need it. It's the right species, the right seed zones, or the right elevation bands. When you start breaking everything down, it can be challenging to make sure you have seed for where you need it. And in addition to quantity, it's making sure you have quality seed. So making sure you have the genetic integrity, making sure the seed that you're planting, you're utilizing genetics from the proper location when you're planting. So you're not, utilizing offsite genetics, that you're being very, very careful on how you're moving genetics in terms of seed source movement. And the genetic integrity of those seeds has been tracked properly. There was a time that, early 1900s, where genetic integrity wasn't something we worried as much about. A Doug fir was a Doug fir. And when you plant offsite seeds, there can be negative consequences. And so making sure we're being very, very careful about knowing where our seeds come from, and we're tracking that the whole way through. Cleanliness is another one. Again, I came from the nursery world. Seed cleanliness and germination rates are very, very important to making sure we best utilize the limited nursery space we have. If you have 100 pounds of seed, but it's only 90% pure, you really only have 90 pounds of viable seed, because that other 10% that's not, the 10% of impurity, is other stuff that's not going to create a living tree. It's things like pitch and seed wings and those sorts of things that aren't going to be helpful in actually growing trees. Germination rates are another piece of that. If you have 90% cleanliness and 90% germination rates on 100 pounds of seed, you really only have 80 pounds of seed that can create viable trees. And so being mindful of the quality of the seed we have, and in our collections, making sure we're collecting, as we're collecting cones with high fill rates, and then going through as we're processing and making sure we get clean seed and testing germination on a regular basis, making sure that we're maintaining high quality seed banks. Also being mindful of production cycles. So one of the challenges that we had in my previous employer was, with climate change and, some of the weird summer weather patterns we've had in the Northwest in recent years, that, there's a high prevalence of aborted cones. And so, what 30 years ago may have been a very reliable production cycle for a given species in a given location may not be as reliable anymore. And so making sure we're collecting when we can, where we can. Libby mentioned seed source movement. As we're thinking about climate adapted reforestation, and we're thinking about seed quantity, seed quality, production cycles, making sure we're thinking about where we really should be getting seed for a given location. And lastly, with seeds, working together, working cross boundaries, cross forests, cross regions, cross ownerships, doing what we can to make sure that we are getting the seeds we need for the right species, the right locations, to some extent, regardless of whose land they're on. There are a lot of challenges with doing that, making sure that it's an equitable process for everybody and everybody's getting what they need, and all of that. But I think a lot of those challenges can be overcome. And I think working together with seeds is going to be very, very important going forward. Next slide, please. So seedlings. So as we start talking seedlings, in the area that this strategy was developed, we're looking at ramping up reforestation efforts from roughly 2,500 acres per year to 15,000 acres per year. So as we're doing that, I think we need to be very, very mindful of making sure we're planting the right species in the right places. So site-specific reforestation, utilizing those local experts to make those site-specific decisions. And then also making sure we're utilizing the most appropriate stock type. And for stock type, it's going to be species dependent. Some species work really, really well as bare root trees. Some don't work as well as bare root trees, and they work really well as container seedlings. So making sure your species matches your stock type. Also, planting season. One solution that's been mentioned to minimize some of the staffing concerns is utilizing fall planting more in this area. It's a great opportunity if you can plant the trees after the first rain and before the first big freeze. You can actually get a lot of planting done in the fall. However, you need to utilize a container stock type for that, a plug type seedling for fall planting, because bare roots you cannot shut down and have an adequate seedling to plant. And so making sure you're picking the right stock type for your planting season. And then another consideration with stock type is planting labor. So in general, bare root seedlings are a bit easier to plant, or bare root seedlings take a little bit more skill to plant properly. Bare root seedlings, you can have some great survival on droughty sites if they're planted properly, but again, it takes a little bit more skill. And so as we're ramping up reforestation across the Western United States, we're going to be utilizing more and more new planters. And as you bring in new planters, the ability to plant a bare root seedling properly it's going to be a little bit harder. There's going to be more planting error. And so if you're in an area where you're going to be utilizing a lot of new planters as your planting labor, utilizing a container stock type that's a little bit easier to plant properly might be beneficial. Getting into the quantity, another consideration is nursery capacity and making sure we're being cognizant of what's happening with nursery capacity. Again, coming from the nursery world, capacity has been a discussion point for several years, and there's a lot of money floating around to increase capacity at state, private, and tribal nurseries. And it's not just federal lands, it's not just post-fire reforestation, but seedling demand across the Western United States has skyrocketed in the last few years to a point that it's been very, very difficult for nurseries to keep up. And just for reference, 15,000 acres per year at 225 trees per acre, these are just some, back of the envelope calculations, comes out to about 3.4 million trees per year. That equates to about 3 acres of greenhouse per year dedicated to that 15,000 acres. And again, for reference, Washington DNR State Nursery, they have about 2 acres of greenhouse infrastructure in their facility. And so as we're ramping up, as we're increasing reforestation needs, we need to be thinking about that entire pipeline from seeds through seedling production to planting labor. And with infrastructure, it's not just nursery infrastructure, but it's also the infrastructure out in the local areas. Things like seedling coolers, transportation networks, vans and trucks to transport seedlings to the woods from your local seedling cooler. All those things are going to could be potential bottlenecks in this process. Next slide, please. So just some considerations and thoughts that I've had. I'm really impressed with the way that this whole strategy was developed. Again, I came in right at the very, very end, right as we were finalizing the document. And I was very impressed with the way that the various partners came together and worked together to look for and find solutions. It was, I believe, was a very successful process. And it's something that I believe was built in a way that can be replicated in other areas. One aspect that I noticed in talking with various folks is the scale of what we're dealing with can be difficult to grasp. Again, we're 2,500 acres to 15,000 acres. It's a big change. And sometimes I think it can be hard to really understand and grasp what that change is going to mean and how to really tackle that size of an issue. Going through these processes, trust is absolutely crucial. Trust is not something that's super easy to build. I think a lot of us in forestry are a little bit on the skeptical side, and it can take us a little while to build trust with people. But doing so, I think, is absolutely crucial, and something that as we're working through all of these steps, whether it's seedling, and staffing, all of the next steps we're working on, making sure that we are building and maintaining trust is going to be very, very important. I think partnerships are a necessity. Again, thinking through how to solve these problems, having different minds in there to think, help us think outside the box and work together and utilize each other's strengths, I think is going to be very, very important. Again, with staffing, the American Forest partnering with the Forest Service, as a nonprofit entity, we have some opportunities to bring people in that the Forest Service may not have. We're able to, we may have a little bit quicker hiring system. We may have some perks that we can offer an employee that are a little bit more difficult for a Forest Service to offer. And so it's a benefit we have in being able to bring people into those areas and into those workforces. And so utilizing those partnerships, I think, is absolutely crucial. And last, think outside the box. These are big challenges. And the way we used to do things may not be the way we need to do things going forward. And really being creative and not being afraid to throw out new ideas, I think, is going to be very important. For reference, that image on the right side of the screen, that Doug fir seedling, is a LE pot container. It's a container system that a lot of nurseries in the Northwest are trying out in lieu of the traditional styro blocks we've used. There's some potential benefits to it. There's some potential drawbacks to it, but it's something that the nurseries have been looking at and saying, hey, this might help us solve this problem. It's something that we haven't traditionally done over the last 3-4 decades. It's a very different system, but it might help us solve some of our issues. On the previous slide, I mentioned infrastructure. Just for reference, that image on the lower left is a seedling freezer with about 1 million trees in it. When we start talking about freezing trees, keeping trees cold, storage and all that, infrastructure is really important. And again, thinking outside the box. Historically, we would often utilize, our own organization-owned seedling coolers. But thinking about, hey, is there like in Eastern Washington, we have a lot of fruit growers, and so rather than building or trying to revamp old seedling coolers, can we utilize an apple cooler that's not being used that time of year? Those sorts of things. I think if I were to leave you with one thing, it's I guess 2 things. Would be build trust and think outside the box as we move forward trying to solve these issues. And I think with that, we'll take questions.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I find this your work really exciting. And so we do have a question that came in, but I did want to say, definitely send me those job announcements. We have youth that we've trained up in the Southwest that might be interested in moving. And so many of the challenges that you're facing are similar to northern New Mexico, other regions. So I think sharing this model is really useful. So Chris asked a question, was the do nothing option explored, considered? Is natural successional forestry a component of restoration at all to help minimize cost and labor? And I guess, Libby, this probably goes back to your graphs where natural regeneration was certainly a portion, but there's probably more that you could add.
Yeah, so I think, the goal was to really identify areas on the landscape where activities could be conducted. And I think that comes back to two specific spaces. One is that the prioritization process kind of identifies those locations where do nothing options might be warranted. So those are those low priority areas that we identified throughout the prioritization process. And I think that helps land managers make that distinction between, where they want to go first versus where they might want to take that do nothing approach. I was going to say one other thing and it escaped me, so maybe I'll come back to it, but
okay,
we'll leave it at that for now.
Fair enough. And Claudio says, so good to see the collaboration across multiple stakeholders, and asks if you are developing similar strategies for different regions.
Yeah, so we have, this is our initial one for a smaller landscape or regional scale reforestation strategy, restoration strategy. We have helped to facilitate the development of the California, my brain is working well today. I'm going to take a step back for just a second, start that over. We have been the facilitators of the California Forest and Wildfire Resilience Task Force, California Reforestation Strategy. That's a mouthful. So we've been working diligently with Region 5 and CAL FIRE and a suite of other partners in that area to develop that. And then we're taking steps into a few others as well. So stay tuned. We should have some more information to share with folks eventually.
Great. Yeah, I think, it's a really exciting project. And so I think a number of us in other regions are thinking, this is great. And along those lines, I think, Libby, you sort of you were a little bit humble in your discussion of some of the geospatial analysis that went on. I sort of feel that we probably could have spent our entire time discussing some of the mapping and the prioritization. And as a recovering geospatial analyst, I'm curious about it, but I also recognize that that's probably, in some ways, I know it's hard work, but it's the easy part. Some of the things that Brian touched on, getting people in the right places and the infrastructure, the acres and acres of greenhouses, that feels to me like I kind of have some idea of how to do the geospatial piece, but some of those other pieces are a big challenge. Although we have a sort of once in a generation influx of dollars. So if there's ever a chance to be able to do it, it feels like now is it. So I guess there's probably not a question in there, but that was what was knocking around in my head. Anybody else, feel free to unmute. It's a relatively small group, so you can unmute and ask a question, or, Libby and Brian, you can kind of expound and augment what you've already shared.
I will say, if anyone has any questions about the geospatial analysis, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to have those conversations about how we got from point A to point B. And if anybody is interested in having conversations about expanding this to other locations or regions, please reach out. We would love to have those conversations.
Well, maybe one, not to go too far down the road, but one question about the geospatial analysis is, there's some processes where there's a fair amount of data creation. And then, there are others where folks are more willing to take off the shelf land fire or National Atlas kind of data. Is it a relatively easy answer to describe kind of where you fit on that spectrum in this process?
I would say we tended to fall more on the side of trying to take data sets that were pre-existing, but we did create some along the road. So it was a combination of both, but definitely on the farther end of the spectrum for taking what already exists.
Yeah, I think there's so much out there now, and it makes it more replicable. So.
Yeah, I will say, I think especially as the desire to really make these integrated processes, as that continues, having, there's a ton of geospatial data, I would say, especially for like these fire and forest components. But if you recall back, one of the major categories that we had were meadows, and that is in large part because it's a huge priority for the Klamath tribes, and we want all partners represented. But that layer in particular came from a bunch of hard work that folks through the tribes have done. And so, I think that was definitely like a limitation, was trying to understand where those other vegetation types fit in and how we might best understand how to integrate those processes into the broader assessment process.
It also highlights that I think our key here is that it was locally driven and locally informed. The focus on meadows might be different in other locations, other tribes having different priorities or other stakeholders. So yeah, although it's nice to use off-the-shelf data and make it replicable, having it tied to the location goes back to something Brian was saying about trust. And both trust in the process and trust in that it's representing value. So that's I like that as well. Okay, Rachel is asking a question. Did your cost estimates per reforestation treatment type look at a standard stocking density, or did they account for targeted planting strategies, i.e. potential refugia sites or microsites?
Yeah, so for this, we really just looked at standard stocking densities. We want to understand how those costs are going to manifest across that large scale. But again, we didn't get down into the site-specific prescriptions. So those densities can and should vary with those site-specific prescriptions, but we didn't want to wade into that too deeply here to allow some flexibility for each jurisdiction to make those site-specific recommendations on their own and move forward as they see fit for their priorities and goals.
Makes sense. Claudio adds, it's good to hear that different stakeholders were on the same page for some essential things. And he's wondering, what were the main challenges for developing this strategy when incorporating multiple views?
It's a hard question. I honestly think this process was fairly straightforward and was probably easier than it could have been in a lot of locations because there was such a strong foundation of collaborative work on the landscape prior to the start of the strategy development. So I felt a little awkward coming in as, the American Forest facilitator, and everybody on the core team already knew one another really well. They're having their side conversations, so I think that we got really lucky in having those relationships, that trust, that, and it's a decade long, I think at this point, that trust has already been established. The other piece that I think kind of tends to unite folks is the face of these really large scale tragedies. So I think that, in the face of 650,000 acres across 2 counties that burned, there's a lot of just, we want to start doing good work on the ground. We want to make sure that there are forests across the landscape, and we want to prevent these future catastrophic wildfires from coming through again. And so you have that kind of set base foundation for what that is going to look like more broadly. And again, by allowing those site-specific prescriptions to vary across partners and land ownerships, I don't think we needed to wade into a lot of those spaces that could potentially be controversial across the landowners and different goals and objectives. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't think so, but I think that was one of the things that really made this successful was that area has has a history of working together, and then you know, I've heard from various folks who have worked in other areas that have been impacted by fires such as this one, and there does seem to be a kind of a coming together to solve the problem afterwards. Where, you know, pre-fire, it may have been really difficult to get some of these groups to really work together on something, but there's a little bit of, you know, coming together to solve the problem. It's you know, it impacts the entire community, the whole area, and so they kind of band together to see what they can do to fix it or help fix it.
Yeah. Well, we're back at the top of the hour, and so we should probably wrap up here. But I really want to say again thanks to our presenters. This is inspiring to me, and it's nice to have just a cool project that's stepping up to address the challenges that we've all been talking about in different contexts and different ways for years. So thank you for sharing. And we'll share the recording, and maybe in, I don't know, 2 years or something, we can have you back on to talk a little bit about the progress and continuing challenges and that sort of thing, because this is not a small task and something that many of us will be facing. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great. Have a good afternoon, everybody.